Hi, Peter Charles here, Folks for Life Fly Fishing. And today I had a question come up on a recent video of mine regarding how to assess whether you can put a sink tip on a particular line and whether it'll work or not. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes trial and error to determine this. Now, in my video on airflow flow tips, I did have a mathematical formula that will work when you're using a Skagit head. And the thing is, with Skagit heads, they have very thick tips. So you know the turnover force is going to be there to turn over your sink tip. It's just a question of making sure that the sink tip matches the Skagit head. Now, when we're talking about other line systems, it's not always that clear whether you'll get a clean turnover or not. So I thought I would run through the trial and error process on how we can determine whether our line is turning over that sink tip properly or not. And there's three conditions. We can have too light, just right, the Goldilocks zone, or too heavy. Too light's not much of a problem. That really just means dialing back your casting so you don't overpower the cast and have the thing kicking around all over the place. But just right's not a problem. Too heavy, that can be a real problem, because what happens is you end up with a puddle of fly, leader, and sink tip, and you're not getting the correct distance, and you can actually end up with some tangles if you're not careful. Plus, you can also end up with your fly on the bottom because the whole thing is sinking and there's not much tension when it's all collapsed. So let's go over what that looks like. And what I've got here is a simple rig just to demonstrate what it would look like. So here we're making our cast. Our sink tip is ready to start to roll over. The energy is flowing through the fly line. So let's look at what good looks like. Okay, here's an example of what we would want our loop to look like if things are working properly. The energy has flowed through the floater and into the sink tip, and we have a proper loop. Our leader and our flies back here. So when you have a loop shape like this, what's going to happen, everything's just going to roll over nice and straight, land nice and straight, and begin to fish immediately. So what happens if your sink tip is too heavy? What does it look like? Well, instead of getting this nice loop shape, what we end up with is something that looks like this. Everything opens right up, and you can see everything slows down at the same time. If you're watching your cast, you'll see all of a sudden the sink tip seems to rear up, and the floater starts to drop, and then it's often what happens, you only get to about this point here, and then the whole thing goes bam on the water. So you got the leader, the end of the sink tip, and the fly all puddled together in a mess. It can even get worse. It can end up almost like this, going over almost dead straight. So it's sort of almost like it's a piece of wire instead of a sink tip, and it just goes over. So it would start here, dead straight, and it would just transition to here, dead straight. So it ends up looking something like that. So it's important that when you're trying something out, and experimenting is fine, go for it. If you're not sure if it's going to work, head down to the river. You could even a pond. You don't need a river situation to check this out. As long as you've got some water, you could actually do it on grass if you're good at casting off of grass. You could actually check this out if you've got a local park. But you want to see the energy flow through the sink tip as if the floater and the sink tip were a continuous piece of line. Like if you're casting a floater and it just rolls out, that's what your sink tip should look like. It should look like just a continuation of the fly line. And you shouldn't get any crashing and kicking around, which usually tells you it's too light for the head, or you shouldn't get, that sort of wide open loop and everything just drops. Now, of course, you can get into some casting situations that can cause these problems too. But I mean, if you're a reasonably good caster and you know what you're doing with the casting, then you know it's not you. You know it's the line. And that's the important bit. So, as I say, sometimes math helps, and sometimes it's just a matter of trial and error. What we're looking for, you can do an assessment of this. The average grains per foot of the line versus the average grains per foot of the tip. The tip should never be more than 75% of the grains per foot of the line. but there's an extra element, and that's the thickness of the fly line, the floater, where we're connecting the sink tip, like this joint right here. And if that joint is too thin right here, this part here is too thin, it doesn't matter how heavy the back end is. You know, that could weigh a ton. If this is skinny right here, then you're going to get that problem where it just sort of flies up in the air and then plop. So that's difficult to assess. You know, you can sit there and look at it, but I mean, if you grab a Skagit head and you put it beside, let's say, a Scandi line, and look at the tip thickness, you'll see what I'm talking about. The Scandi line has a very skinny tip, meant for that beautiful smooth turnover, and the Skagit has a great big thick clunky tip designed for turning over sink tips. So you can make a rapid assessment just by looking at the tip section of the line. But if you're not sure, there's no harm in trying. Just put some yarn on the end if you don't want to worry about snagging up a fly. Put a bit of yarn on a 3-foot leader and a bit of yarn and see what happens. And don't be afraid to experiment. And, you know, get out there and give it a try. And to say, if you're decent at casting off of grass, you can try it off of grass. It'll tell you. You'll know pretty quick. If you can cast well off of grass with a floater, you can do this with a sink tip too. Anyway, you know, do what I do. If I'm not sure, I go out and give it a try. Cheers.